What do you do when the people calling themselves your friends protect your cheating fiancé, move into your rental like parasites, and laugh at your overreaction until you quietly take the keys, the locks, and their entire future away? My name is Nolan Price, and I learned the hard way that betrayal is rarely loud when it first arrives, because it usually shows up wearing a friendly grin and carrying a drink you did not ask for. I was 34, the kind of man people called steady because I did not shout in restaurants, and I paid my bills on time, and because I owned property in a way that made certain acquaintances treat my silence like a public utility. I had a rental duplex 2 streets off the water, and a beach house that had been my quiet ambition for years, and I had a fiancée named Elara, who knew how to laugh in a way that made strangers lean closer, as if charm could be harvested like salt from the air. The night everything cracked did not look like a catastrophe on the calendar, because the calendar never tells you which hour will turn into a before and after, and I still believed that adults handled conflict with words and apologies instead of with knives disguised as group texts. We were supposed to meet friends at a place that served coastal cocktails and overpriced oysters, and the plan had been simple enough to be boring, which is exactly the kind of plan you trust. I arrived first, because I am always first, because I was raised on the idea that being dependable is a kind of love, and I took a table with a view of the door and the water, 2 entrances, 2 exits, and a clear line of sight to every mistake. When Elara walked in, she did not walk in alone, and the way her hand hovered near his elbow told me more than any confession could have. He was one of the men orbiting our social circle, the kind of guy who never paid the full bill but always got the loudest laugh, and he moved like he belonged in any room as long as someone else was responsible for consequences. Elara introduced him with a casualness that tried to make my eyes lie to my brain, and she kissed my cheek with the soft, public affection people use to certify normalcy. I asked a question that felt reasonable and sounded calm, because calm is my native language, and she gave me an answer that was too quick, too rehearsed, too smooth, like a door that closes without a latch. Our friends arrived in a wave, loud and comfortable, and they acted as if the universe existed to host their personalities. I watched faces, because that is what you do when you sense you are being positioned in a story you did not write, and I saw it in the glances that slid away too late, in the smiles that tightened at the edges, in the rhythm of conversation that kept steering away from certain details. Elara sat beside me, close enough that her perfume could have been an apology, and yet her attention kept wandering to the other side of the table, where that man sat with a grin that did not reach his eyes. When someone teased Elara about being too friendly, she laughed in the easy way she always did, and when I let the silence stretch for one breath too long, our friends filled it quickly, not to comfort me, but to bury the moment. Later, when the evening began to thin out and the drinks started making people honest in the laziest way, someone said it out loud, not as a confession, but as a joke that assumed I had agreed to be the punchline. It was a comment about Elara and the man having disappeared together earlier, how it was probably nothing, how I was so serious, how jealousy was not a good look, and the table laughed with the kind of unity people reserve for shared cruelty. I did not throw a glass, and I did not stand up and make a speech because I have never believed in giving a crowd the satisfaction of my panic. I watched Elara's face, waiting for her to correct it, waiting for her to show the kind of loyalty that requires effort. And she did not, because her smile stayed in place like a sticker over a crack in a wall. After dinner, I walked her to the car, and she tried to talk as if the night had been harmless entertainment, as if my discomfort was a dramatic hobby she could tease away. I asked again, slower this time, because sometimes you give someone space to choose decency when they are standing at the edge of it. She called it a one-time mistake before I had even used the word, and that was the first real moment of truth, because people usually label their own crime when they are trying to shrink it. She blamed the drinks, She blamed the attention, she blamed stress, and then she blamed me in the soft, careful way that sounds like therapy language and feels like a slap. She said I made her feel invisible sometimes. She said I focused too much on work. She said I was always managing something, and she said all of it like those were reasons, not excuses. The next morning, the friends came in through my phone like they owned it, because that is what people do when they think your boundaries are a decorative fence. I woke up to messages that read like a committee decision, a chorus of certainty delivered with emojis and fake concern. They said it was a one-time mistake. They said Elara was hurting. They said I should not ruin everything. And they said I was overreacting with the casual authority of people who were not the ones betrayed. One of them sent a long paragraph about forgiveness, and it had the tone of someone giving advice from a high ground they did not earn. Another told me to think of the wedding deposits, the families, the plans, as if money and optics were more sacred than trust. They were not asking what happened, because they already knew, and they were not asking how I felt, because that would have required them to treat me like a person instead of a problem to be managed. I did not argue with them, because arguments are a kind of intimacy, and I was done feeding intimacy into mouths that only chewed it for flavor. I read, I listened, and I noticed something that had been there the whole time if you were willing to look without excuses. Two of the loudest voices in the group were also the two friends currently living in one side of my rental property, supposedly temporarily, supposedly while they got back on their feet, supposedly because the universe had been unfair and I was kind. They had moved in months ago with promises and gratitude, and they had stayed with excuses and a growing sense of entitlement that slid into my life like sand under a door. They always had a reason the rent was late, a reason the job offer fell through, a reason they needed just one more month, and they always spoke about my place like it was a community resource instead of a private asset. When I saw their names in my messages telling me I was overreacting, something in my chest went quiet, and quiet can be more dangerous than anger because it makes decisions feel clean. They were not simply defending Elara, because loyalty was not their currency, but they were defending the arrangement that kept them comfortable. Elara had always treated their presence as normal, and she had always been generous with my resources in a way that required my silence as the receipt. She liked being seen as the center of a circle, and circles cost money, and I was the kind of man who paid for peace until I finally understood that peace purchased with self-respect is always counterfeit. I spent that day doing normal things in a way that would have looked calm from the outside because I still had work, and I still had tenants, and I still had a life that required functioning. I made coffee, I answered emails, I walked through my beach house with the windows open, letting salt air do what it could to scrub the smell of last night out of my mind. I checked my calendar, not for comfort, but for control. Because control is what you reach for when you realize you have been living in someone else's version of you. I looked at the group chat again, and I noticed how they spoke about my feelings as if they were a weather event, inconvenient but temporary, something you just wait out. I noticed how no one asked the obvious question, the question that would have required them to confront their own complicity. Why did Elara feel safe enough to do that in front of them with their laughter as cover? By evening, Elara came home with the careful, apologetic tone that people use when they want you to forgive them without making them uncomfortable. She said she wanted to talk, and she said it as if she had not been talking all day through other people's mouths. She sat at the kitchen counter like a guest in her own crime scene, and she tried to sell me a story where she was the tragic lead, overwhelmed, pressured, human. She said she loved me, and she said it like love was a coupon you could still redeem after you had burned the store down. I listened without interrupting, because interrupting gives people the illusion that they are in a debate rather than on trial. When she finished, she waited for my reaction, and I gave her the one thing she was not prepared for, which was a lack of performance. I told her I needed time, and I meant time in the way a locksmith means time, as a space to change what needs changing while everyone assumes the door will still open. Elara took my calm as weakness, because that is what certain people do, and she went to bed like the problem had been filed under temporary, like my dignity was a minor inconvenience that would dissolve by morning. I stayed up, not drinking, not spiraling, just thinking, and in the quiet I remembered the way those two tenants had joked about my beach house before, the way they had hinted they wanted to use it for a friends' weekend, the way Elara had smiled as if she could volunteer my property like a donation at a fundraiser. Some men respond to humiliation with rage because rage is loud and therefore feels powerful, but I had learned in real estate and in life that power is usually a sequence of signatures and keys. I opened my laptop and pulled up the lease documents for the rental unit, reading the terms the way you read a map when you realize you are lost on purpose. The lease was month to month, and the rules were clear enough to be enforceable without theatrics. I checked the payment history, and I found what I already knew, which was that they had been late more often than not, and I had documented it because documentation is what you do when you want the truth to survive other people's stories. I printed a notice to vacate, not as revenge, but as correction, and I did it with a steady hand because the hand does not shake when the decision is already made. I dated it, signed it, and placed it in a clean envelope like an invitation to reality. Then I did the second thing, the thing that hurt more because it was personal and not legal. I opened my phone, scrolled through the group chat, and I began blocking them one by one, not with anger, not with speeches, but with the cold finality of someone closing a door without slamming it. When I reached Elara's name, I paused, because some habits still pretend they are love, and then I blocked her too, because love that requires humiliation as the entry fee is not love, it is a hostage situation. That night, I slept in the guest room, and the house felt different, not empty, but reclaimed. In the morning, I drove to the rental property with the envelope in my coat pocket and a spare set of keys on the passenger seat. The neighborhood was the kind of place people described as charming because they had never been in a real crisis there, and the sun made everything look innocent. I walked up the steps, knocked, and waited, because even when you are done being kind, you can still be civil. One of them opened the door with a face that assumed I was there to talk, to negotiate, to be talked around, and I handed him the envelope with the same calm you use when you hand someone their check at the end of a job. He looked at it, and his expression shifted, because even entitled people understand paper when it threatens comfort. He started talking fast, like speed could rewrite ink, and he called me dramatic, and he called me petty, and he called me cruel, and each word was proof that he had never considered the possibility of consequences. I said nothing for a moment, letting his voice echo in the doorway, because the best way to show someone you are serious is to refuse the emotional dance they are trying to lead. Then I told him, slowly and clearly, that the unit was mine, the lease was month to month, and they had 30 days to leave, and I told him that the notice was not a negotiation, but a calendar. He tried to argue about timing, about friendship, about loyalty, and that was almost funny, because loyalty had been the theme of the week, and he had treated it like a joke. He asked if Elara knew, and I did not answer, because my life was no longer a committee project. I turned back toward my car, and I heard him call my name with a tone that tried to shame me into softness. I kept walking anyway, because when you finally stop buying peace, you have to accept that some people will call you cruel simply because you are no longer useful. By the time I got home, my phone had already started buzzing with the first tremors of panic, because the eviction notice had made its way through the group like a spark in dry grass. The messages shifted tone fast, because nothing makes people find empathy like the threat of losing their own comfort. A friend who had told me to forgive Elara now asked if we could talk this out like adults. Another who had called me overreactive now said he understood my pain, as if pain was a meeting agenda item he could acknowledge for points. I watched it unfold with a detached clarity that felt almost peaceful, and I realized that their loyalty had never been to any person, but to the arrangement that benefited them. Elara woke up late, walked into the kitchen, and found a silence that did not welcome her. She tried to ask what was going on, and I told her that the house had boundaries now, and that she was on the outside of them until further notice. She tried to cry, but the tears looked like strategy, because she kept peeking at me between sobs to see if the performance was working. When it did not, her voice sharpened, and she accused me of trying to punish everyone, and she used the word everyone like it was the moral center of the universe. I told her I was not punishing everyone, because punishment implies a desire to cause pain, and what I wanted was simple, which was to remove parasites from my life before they turned my future into a shared joke. That was the day I stopped being the man who smiled through disrespect. That was the day my quiet became something else, something that could cut cleanly, and when the phone rang again, with another message from another friend, I did not feel tempted to reply. I felt interested, the way you feel when you finally see what people are when they think you will never stop paying for their comfort. The problem with a social circle is that it acts like a town with no borders, and when you stop subsidizing it, the town notices immediately. By the second day, rumors had already started growing legs, and those legs were carrying a story where I was the unstable villain who overreacted to a one-time mistake, and Elara was the misunderstood heroine trapped in a cold man's rigidity. I did not correct the story because I knew from experience that people who want a villain will build one out of whatever material is available, and arguing with them only gives them new material. Instead, I watched the way the narrative shifted depending on who was most afraid in the moment, because fear is the real editor in most people's lives. The two tenants, Milo and Soren, came to my door that afternoon with the eviction notice folded like an insult in Milo's fist. Milo talked first, because Milo always talked first, and he began with the language of friendship, which was the first lie. He said he could not believe I would do this, and he said it like disbelief was a legal defense. Soren stood behind him, arms crossed, trying to look calm, but his eyes kept flicking past me into the house, toward the kind of comfort he had started assuming was permanent. Elara was in the living room, hovering, pretending she was not part of the machinery that had pushed them into this, and I could see her trying to calculate whether she should support them publicly to preserve her good person image. Milo asked if I was seriously going to throw them out over drama, and I told him the unit was not a charity program, and my life was not a couch. He tried to pivot, offering partial rent, offering a promise, offering anything except accountability, and I let him talk until he ran out of speed. Then I told him the date did not change, and I told him if he wanted to appeal, he could do it with paper, not with guilt. When he realized I was not going to bend, he did what people like him always do when they lose leverage, which is that he tried to take my reputation hostage. He said he would tell people what kind of man I really was, and I told him people already knew, because they had watched my fiancée cheat on me and then called me overreactive, and I said it so casually that it landed like a stone. Soren, who had been quiet, finally spoke, and his voice carried a different kind of panic, the kind that shows up when someone realizes they have been living inside someone else's generosity without building their own foundation. He asked where they were supposed to go, and I gave him the honest answer, which was that he should ask the people he had been so loyal to yesterday. I told him his friends could take him in, and I told him Elara could offer her couch, and I said it with a calm that made Milo's anger look childish. Elara flinched at that, because suddenly the consequences were not abstract anymore, and her performance of empathy had to compete with the reality of inconvenience. They left in a storm of muttered insults, and the door closed behind them with a soft click that felt like the end of a chapter. Elara turned on me immediately because she needed someone to blame, and she said I was humiliating people, and she said it like humiliation was a sin only when it happened to the wrong person. I asked her quietly if she had been worried about my humiliation when she made her mistake in front of our friends, and her face hardened, because questions like that leave no room for theatrics. She said I was making it worse, and I told her it had already been made worse, and that all I was doing was refusing to carry it. That night, the group chat I had already blocked continued its life without me, but pieces of it leaked through mutual acquaintances like smoke under a door. A co-worker of mine, a woman I barely knew, asked if everything was okay, and she said it with that careful tone people use when they are curious but want to sound kind. A neighbor waved a little too slowly when I checked the mail, and her eyes lingered, not on my face, but on the space around me, as if she expected to see Elara behind me to certify which version of the story was real. I did not correct anyone, because the truth has a way of ripening when you stop trying to force it early. The next morning, I drove to the beach house. It was not a vacation move, not an escape for comfort, but a retreat for clarity. The beach house was my one place where no one had history with me except the walls. And walls do not gossip. The air smelled like salt and sun-warmed wood, and the sound of waves made human drama feel small in the right way. I walked through each room, checking locks, checking windows, checking the simple physical facts of ownership, and as I did, I remembered every time Elara had referred to this place as ours, in a way that assumed she would never have to earn it. By noon, my phone started buzzing again, not with the blocked friends, but with numbers I recognized from the edges of my life. People who had stayed quiet at first were reaching out now, because the eviction notice had turned a moral conversation into a practical one, and practical is where hypocrisy dies. One woman, who had once called Elara her sister, suddenly wanted to know what really happened. Another asked if Milo and Soren could stay at the beach house for a weekend to clear their heads, and the request was so shameless that I almost laughed, because entitlement always reveals itself when it is desperate. I told her no, and I told her that the beach house was not a group therapy facility, and I hung up before she could pivot into guilt. Elara arrived at the beach house later than she said she would, and she walked in with a bag packed like she assumed I was still operating on old rules. She looked around like she was inspecting her property, and the audacity of it would have been impressive if it had not been so predictable. She said she needed a calm place to talk, and I told her calm was available, but comfort was not guaranteed. She started with apology again, because apology is cheap when you keep the product, and then she tried to negotiate the terms of my boundaries as if boundaries were a mutual project. She said I could not just kick people out, and I reminded her that I did not kick them out overnight. I gave them 30 days, which is more courtesy than they gave me. Then she tried a different tactic, and she suggested that I was doing all this because I wanted control, because accusing someone of control is a common way to distract from the fact that you have been controlling the narrative through manipulation. I told her control was exactly what I had lost when she cheated, and when our friends laughed, and that regaining control by enforcing my own property rights was not cruelty. It was sanity. She called me cold, and I told her cold is what happens when warmth is taken for granted, long enough that it stops being an instinct. When she saw that emotional tactics were failing, she shifted into anger, because anger is what people use when charm stops working. She told me that everyone thought I was overreacting, and she said it like a weapon, like public opinion was a judge with power over my life. I asked her why she cared so much about what everyone thought, and she could not answer without admitting what I already knew, which was that her real relationship was not with me, it was with the audience. She wanted to be seen as a good person, even while she did bad things, and she needed my silence to keep her reflection clean. I told her I had blocked the group, and she looked shocked, because the concept of losing access to me had never occurred to her as a real possibility. She asked how long I was going to punish her, and I told her this was not punishment, this was separation, and there was a difference. Punishment is emotional, and separation is structural, and I was done living inside her emotions. She asked if the wedding was off, And I told her the wedding was a fantasy until trust returned, and trust does not return because someone demands it. It returns because someone rebuilds it with effort and accountability. That night, she slept in the guest room again, and I slept in the master. Not because I wanted to claim the bed, but because I refused to exile myself from my own life to make her feel comfortable. In the morning, I woke to a voicemail from Milo, and his tone had changed from anger to pleading, and the shift would have been almost comedic if it had not been so revealing. He said they had nowhere to go. He said no one was answering. He said it was not fair. And he said it like fairness meant I owed him shelter even after he had tried to shame me for having boundaries. I listened to the whole message without reacting because I wanted to hear the full shape of his entitlement. And when it ended, I deleted it. By the end of the week, the group's tune had changed publicly because private fear had finally reached their mouths. People began messaging me with apologies that sounded like they had been written by committee, and they all had the same key ingredient, which was self-interest. They were sorry I felt hurt, sorry it came out wrong, sorry things had escalated, but none of them were sorry for siding against me when it was socially convenient. One asked if we could all meet and clear the air, and I knew exactly what that meant, which was a meeting designed to pressure me back into compliance. I did not agree, because compliance is what got me here. Elara watched this unfold with widening panic because she could feel the social floor shifting under her feet. She had expected the group to act as her shield, and she had expected me to stay quiet in the corner to preserve the illusion. When the shield began to crack, she did what people like her do, which is that she tried to rebuild it with urgency. She suggested we invite everyone to the beach house for a reset weekend, and the suggestion was so absurd it made something cold in me almost warm again, because at least now the delusion was visible. I told her no, and I told her this house was not a stage for damage control. Later that night, she tried to bargain in a softer way, telling me she would do anything to fix it, and I asked her what anything meant when there were real consequences. I asked if she was willing to tell the truth to the same friends who had defended her, not in private, not in whispers, but openly. And I asked if she was willing to name what she did without shrinking it into a mistake. She went quiet because that kind of honesty costs social currency, and Elara had always treated social currency like oxygen. I walked out onto the deck with a glass of water, watching the waves roll in with indifferent rhythm, and I understood the real fear moving through the group now. It was not guilt, and it was not empathy, and it was not suddenly recognizing my humanity. It was the sudden realization that the man they had taken for granted owned doors they needed, and that I had finally decided to close them. I stood there long enough for the cold air to sharpen my thoughts, and when I went back inside, Elara was staring at her phone like it had betrayed her, because messages were coming in, not asking if she was okay, but asking where Milo and Soren were going to sleep. She looked up at me with a mixture of anger and disbelief, and she asked if I was proud of myself, as if I had done something petty. I told her pride had nothing to do with it, because pride is noisy and I was done being noisy. I told her I was simply refusing to be the foundation for people who used my stability as a ladder to climb above me. She tried to say something sharp, but the words stalled, because she could finally see what she had created, which was a social circle built on borrowed resources and pretend loyalty. That was when I decided the next move would not be a conversation, because conversations had already been weaponized against me. The next move would be a plan, the kind that does not require anyone's permission, the kind that uses paper and dates and keys, the kind that makes people face reality in a public way they cannot laugh off. And as Elara's phone kept buzzing, as her friends kept scrambling, I understood the real power I had been carrying all along, which was not money or property, but the ability to stop explaining myself to people who never listened in good faith. By the following Monday, the group's moral certainty had collapsed into logistics, and logistics is where people reveal what they truly worship. Milo and Soren had tried every couch in our circle, and each one had turned into a polite excuse because the same mouths that called me overreactive were suddenly allergic to the smell of responsibility. I kept hearing the same phrases filtered back through mutual contacts, the same soft refusals disguised as compassion, the same pretend regret about limited space and early work schedules, and I pictured them all arranging their homes like stage sets, where generosity existed only as a story they told about themselves. In the old version of my life, I would have been tempted to call someone, to negotiate, to make it easier for them, because I used to confuse making things easier with being good. But that temptation died quickly when I remembered their laughter at the restaurant table and how easy it had been for them to make my humiliation a communal activity. Elara drifted through the beach house like a person waiting for a verdict she assumed she could charm into her favor. She kept proposing compromises that were really just ways for her to regain access to the same comforts she had treated as permanent, and every suggestion had the same invisible assumption, which was that my boundaries were a phase, and phases end when everyone gets tired. I noticed her watching me the way you watch a door you expect to open, and I noticed how she flinched when I did not offer casual affection, because she had always used closeness as a kind of social proof. She asked whether I had told my family, and I answered that I had not needed to, because the people involved were already telling stories without my consent, and I preferred to wait until I had facts instead of noise. Noise was everywhere, and it moved faster than truth. One of my cousins texted to ask if I was okay, and the message came with that cautious tone people use when they are trying not to pick a side too early. A neighbor I barely spoke to suddenly found reasons to wave from across the street, and her smile looked like a question. Even my co-workers seemed to look at me longer than usual, as if my face contained an update they were waiting to read. Elara noticed it too, and she began to talk about optics, about how people were watching, about how rumors could damage both of us, and she kept using the word both, as if she had not already spent the weekend damaging me while treating her own reputation like a fragile artifact. I did not correct rumors because I wanted to, but because I needed to, and there is a difference that matters. When lies spread unchecked, they become the foundation for other lies, and I was not going to let my future be built on someone else's convenient fiction. I decided to assemble something simple, something boring, something undeniable, because in my world, boring paperwork is often the most dangerous weapon. I opened a notebook and drew a line down the middle, and on one side I wrote dates, and on the other I wrote claims, because that is how you break a narrative down until it is nothing but measurable parts. Under claims, I wrote the version Elara had offered, the phrase one-time mistake, the phrase drunk and confused, the phrase nothing serious, and I wrote them all without emotion as if I were copying a report. Under dates, I wrote everything I knew with certainty: the dinner, the missing minutes, the group's reaction, the morning messages, the eviction notice, and I left space beneath them for whatever came next. Elara's phone kept lighting up, and each time it did, she became a little more frantic, because every new message carried a new demand she had not expected. Milo and Soren were flooding her with panic, insisting she fix it, insisting she make me reverse the notice, insisting she remind me of friendship, as if friendship was a lever you could pull when your choices finally reached you. She tried to mediate between them and me like a manager trying to calm down two clients, and I let her try because watching her fail was educational. She would come into the room with her expression carefully arranged. Then she would soften her voice and say they were really scared. Then she would look at me as if I were the one causing the fear, and I would remind her, calmly, that fear is often just the sensation of entitlement being removed. I knew I needed one thing above all else, which was clarity on what had happened at that dinner, because the group was treating the event like a small stain they could scrub out with enough pressure on me. Elara had not offered details, and I suspected that was because details tend to betray the liar. So I began to collect what I could, lawfully, quietly, and with zero drama. I asked her, at breakfast, to tell me exactly when she left the table and for how long, and I asked it like a simple timeline question. Because people can often lie about motives, but they struggle to lie about clocks when you force them to be precise. She claimed it had been only a few minutes, that she had gone to the restroom, that the man had followed by coincidence, and she said it with a smoothness that did not match the discomfort around her eyes. I wrote down her timeline without challenging it, because you do not correct a liar at the start. You let them commit to the lie until it hardens into a shape you can measure. Later, when she went to shower, her phone lit up on the kitchen counter, and the screen preview showed a message thread from one of our friends, the friend who had been laughing the loudest. The preview said, "Milo is freaking out," and it said, "You have to talk to Nolan," and it said, "Do not let this blow up," as if my pain were a bomb they were trying to defuse with other people's hands. I did not touch her phone, and I did not scroll, because I did not need more than the preview to understand the shape of their mindset. I simply noted the exact time the preview appeared, and I wrote it in the notebook like a timestamp from a security log, because when a person is trying to control a narrative, time is always the part they forget to guard. That afternoon, I drove back into town for work, and the shift in energy was immediate, because the story had moved through the group and out into the wider social environment like a spill. People smiled too warmly, and they asked how my weekend was in tones that were designed to invite confession without offering support. A coworker I had always considered neutral mentioned Elara casually, asking if we were still planning the wedding, and the question landed like a test. I told her the schedule was uncertain, and I said it without complaint, because complaint becomes a rumor, and I needed to be careful about what I fed into the system. Elara, meanwhile, texted me during the day about how she felt isolated, how she felt judged, how she felt like everyone was turning on her, and I noticed she did not text about how I felt at all, which would have been revealing even if I had not already known. When I returned to the beach house that evening, Elara was sitting with her laptop open and a drink beside it, and she looked like a person preparing a defense. She told me she had been reading about forgiveness, about how couples survive mistakes, about how anger destroys intimacy, and she said it as if research could replace accountability. I asked her a simple question, which was whether she had spoken to the man, and she hesitated for a fraction of a second before saying she had not, and that fraction of a second felt like a crack. I did not accuse her of lying, because accusations give people a stage, and I wanted her to feel stageless. I simply asked again, slower, and she repeated the same answer with a little more irritation, which is what people do when they want to shut down further questions. The next day, I received an email from the property management portal I used for the rental duplex, a routine notification about a maintenance request from Milo and Soren, and the subject line looked innocent until I read it carefully. They were requesting a lock change due to a lost key, and they were asking it in a tone that assumed approval, and I could almost hear Milo's logic behind it, the logic that said, if they controlled the locks, they controlled time. I did not approve the request, and I did not deny it through the portal either, because portals create records, and I wanted my records clean and deliberate. Instead, I drove to the duplex in person, checked the exterior, and spoke to the neighbor next door, a quiet older man who had always been friendly in that distant way people are when they want peace. I asked him casually if he had noticed anything unusual lately, and he said he had seen a lot of visitors late at night, and he said it without drama, like he was describing weather. I thanked him, and I asked him for no further details, because I was not building a case for court. I was building a case for reality. That night, Elara's friends started reaching out again, and the tone had changed from moral lectures to invitations. One suggested we all meet for dinner to clear the air, and another suggested a weekend at the beach house to reset the vibe, and the phrasing was so shameless it made my skin prickle. They were treating my property like a communal resource, and they were trying to convert their panic into an event that would pressure me back into the old role. the role of provider and forgiver and quiet ATM. Elara floated these suggestions to me as if they were reasonable, and she added that it might help everyone feel safer, and she said safer, not better, because she was thinking about their fear, not my trust. I told Elara that I would meet them, but not at the beach house, and not in private, and not in a way that gave them control over the room. I told her I would choose the location, and I told her the conversation would be structured, and I told her there would be no shouting and no theatrics, and if anyone tried, I would leave. She looked relieved at first, because she assumed any meeting meant reconciliation, and then she looked wary, because she could feel the word structured sitting between us like a blade. She asked what I meant by structured, and I told her I meant that claims would be matched to facts, and that I did not intend to debate my own dignity. The meeting was set for Thursday evening at a small community center near the water, a place used for committee gatherings and local forums, the kind of room where people sit in folding chairs and pretend decisions are fair because they happen under fluorescent lights. I chose it because it was neutral, and because neutrality is a kind of pressure, and because the community center had staff who would notice if someone tried to turn it into a spectacle. I did not tell Elara my full reason because I did not need her help, and because once you show your plan to people who benefit from confusion, they will try to fog it. In the days leading up to Thursday, Elara's behavior shifted into something tighter and more performative. She became sweeter, offering coffee, offering to cook, touching my arm as if physical contact could erase history. She also became more controlling in small ways, asking where I was going, asking who I was texting, asking what I planned to say at the meeting, and those questions came wrapped in concern, but the concern was really surveillance of my intentions. I answered politely and vaguely, because vague is sometimes the safest way to keep a plan intact. She grew frustrated with vagueness, because vagueness gives her no angle to manipulate, and I watched that frustration build behind her smile like pressure behind a wall. On Wednesday night, she finally admitted something without meaning to. She was talking about how the group had always depended on me, how I was the stable one, how people looked to me, and she said it with a tone that was supposed to be flattering, but it sounded like ownership. Then she said she had never thought I would actually cut them off, and the way she said actually revealed the truth, which was that my generosity had been treated as a permanent fixture, like plumbing. I let the silence sit for a moment, and then I asked her whether she had ever wondered how it felt to be treated like infrastructure. She tried to laugh it off, but the laugh came out thin because the question had landed in a place she did not want to explore. By Thursday morning, my notebook had become a clean ledger of dates, claims, and small proof points that were not dramatic but were steady. I had the screenshot of the maintenance request subject line printed, because printed paper has a physical seriousness people cannot easily dodge. I had my lease terms highlighted, because when people call you cruel, it helps to remember you are simply enforcing what you already agreed to. I had a small list of questions designed to force specificity, because specificity breaks rehearsed narratives, and rehearsed narratives were the only thing keeping Elara's story from collapsing. And beneath all that, I had a single line I had written the night before, a line that was not emotional, just factual, because facts are often the sharpest thing you can hold. It read, "If they call it a one-time mistake, ask why the group rehearsed the defense so quickly." The afternoon before the meeting, Elara received a call and stepped outside to take it, and I watched her through the window as her posture shifted from soft and apologetic to sharp and managerial. She gestured with her free hand, pacing the deck like someone issuing instructions, and when she came back inside, her face was composed, but her eyes were alert. She told me Milo and Soren wanted to attend too, and she said it as if their presence was normal, as if the eviction were a minor detail, and I said they could attend if they wanted, because I had nothing to hide, and because I wanted them in the room when the truth became expensive. Then she asked me, carefully, whether I planned to embarrass her, and the question was almost funny, because it was so revealing. It was not an apology, and it was not concern for my pain, it was fear of public consequences. I told her calmly that I planned to tell the truth in a room where no one could edit it later, and that if the truth embarrassed her, the embarrassment would belong to her choices, not my words. She stared at me for a long second, and in that second I could see the panic behind her eyes, because she had spent years mastering rooms where the audience mattered more than the facts, and she could feel that Thursday night might be a room she could not charm. The community center smelled like cheap coffee and old carpeting, and the fluorescent lights made everyone look a little guilty even before the conversation started. I arrived early, because I always arrive early, and I chose a seat near the center of the room where I could see every face without turning my head. There was a long folding table at the front, the kind used for neighborhood meetings, and behind it were bulletin boards covered in faded flyers about book clubs and charity drives, reminders of how often people perform goodness in public while behaving differently in private. I placed my folder on my lap and kept my posture relaxed, because the biggest mistake you can make in a room full of manipulators is to look like you are trying too hard. Elara arrived with two of the loudest friends at her side, the ones who had used the word overreacting as if it were a medical diagnosis. Milo and Soren came a few minutes later, and their expressions were tight, because now their survival depended on convincing me to soften, and softening had become a myth they desperately needed to revive. More friends filtered in, people who used to feel like community and now felt like a jury selected by an enemy. They greeted me with cautious smiles, the kind that try to test whether you are angry, because anger is the only emotion they know how to exploit. I nodded politely, because politeness is disarming when it is paired with a refusal to be moved. When everyone sat down, the room settled into a hush that felt staged, because silence in groups is often a performance of seriousness. One of them, a man named Grant, who always seemed to volunteer for leadership when there was no real work involved, said he hoped we could all be adults. And he said it like adulthood meant me accepting humiliation quietly for the comfort of everyone else. Elara sat with her hands folded, wearing an expression that looked almost tender, and I recognized it as the face she used when she wanted to seem reasonable. Milo shifted in his chair like a man itching to interrupt, and Soren stared at the floor as if the floor might offer a loophole. I began calmly, because calm was my best weapon and my truest state. I said I had no interest in shouting, and I said I had no interest in being called names, and I said I would leave if the conversation turned into a pile-on. I told them I had 3 topics, and the first was the dinner, the second was the way they responded afterward, and the third was the rental property, because when you separate issues, you stop people from smearing them together for confusion. Grant tried to smile like this was all a misunderstanding, and he asked if we could start with feelings, and I told him we could start with facts, because feelings had already been used as a club against me. I asked Elara to describe the dinner in her own words, and I asked for a timeline with specific times, not vague impressions. She began with the familiar language, the one-time mistake, the drinks, the stress, and she kept describing the event as if it were an accidental spill. I waited until she finished, and then I asked her to name the exact time she left the table and the exact time she returned. She hesitated, just long enough to show she had not rehearsed that detail, and then she offered a range that was too wide to be honest. One of our friends tried to interrupt, saying the details did not matter, and I replied that details are the only thing that separates truth from performance. Elara said she had gone to the restroom, and she said the man had followed by coincidence. I asked why, if it was coincidence, 3 people at the table joked about it with such confidence, because jokes are rarely born out of coincidence, they are born out of patterns. She tried to smile and say people were being silly, and I watched her eyes flick toward the friend who had laughed the loudest. That friend shifted, and the shift was small, but small shifts are how guilt announces itself. I asked the group calmly whether anyone saw where Elara and the man went during that time, and the room got quieter because the truth was now asking for witnesses. A woman named Paige, who had always been dramatic in small ways, said she thought she saw them outside near the water, and she immediately followed it with a disclaimer that it was probably nothing. I asked her how long she saw them there, and she shrugged, and I could feel the group trying to move forward quickly, because staying on a question is how you make liars sweat. Milo cleared his throat and said everyone was making it bigger than it was, and he said it with that tone of manufactured authority. I looked at him and asked why he cared so much about making it smaller, and he opened his mouth, then closed it, because some answers sound bad no matter how you phrase them. I moved to the second topic, which was their response the next morning. I told them I had read their messages, and I said I would not quote them, because quoting would create an argument about tone instead of content. I asked a simple question, which was how many of them had asked me what I needed, and I watched faces shift as people tried to remember their own words. Then I asked how many of them had told me I was overreacting without asking what happened, and the room went still, because everyone knew the answer and no one wanted to say it. Grant tried to speak, offering something about wanting to keep the peace, and I told him peace that requires one person's humiliation is not peace. It is a hostage arrangement with polite language. Elara's expression tightened, and she asked whether I really wanted to do this in front of everyone, and the question confirmed the whole problem. She did not ask whether she had hurt me. She asked whether I would expose the situation publicly, because her primary fear was reputation. I told her I did not choose the public setting, the group did, when they turned my betrayal into a joke in a public restaurant, and then made it into a group narrative the next morning. I told her that when multiple people insert themselves into a private betrayal, they create a public consequence, and pretending otherwise is just a way to avoid accountability. Then I moved to the third topic, and this was the one that made Milo sit up straighter. I said the rental property had become part of the conversation the moment Milo and Soren told me I was overreacting while living inside my generosity. I said I had issued a lawful notice to vacate based on a month-to-month lease, and I said it was not revenge, it was correction. Milo immediately began to argue, saying housing was serious, saying I was abusing power, saying I was punishing them for their opinions, and his voice rose until the fluorescent room made it sound harsher than he intended. I let him finish, because I wanted everyone to hear the full tantrum, and then I asked him a question that felt almost gentle. I asked him what he thought would happen when he used my resources while publicly undermining my dignity, and I asked it like a teacher asking a student to explain a simple equation. Soren finally looked up, and his eyes were wet, not with guilt, but with fear, and he said they had nowhere to go. I nodded, because I was not trying to torture them, and I told him he did have options, and I listed them plainly, starting with the same friends who had been so eager to lecture me. The room reacted in small ways, shifting, avoiding eye contact, adjusting posture, because now the consequences were being redistributed, and redistribution always makes people uncomfortable. Paige muttered something about not having space, and someone else mentioned pets, and another person said their landlord was strict, and each excuse sounded thinner in the light. At that moment, Elara reached for control. She said this was not fair. She said the rental situation should be separate. She said I was mixing issues, and she said it like she was chairing a meeting. I told her the issues were separate legally, but they were connected morally, because the same people who asked me to swallow betrayal were also the people who felt entitled to my assets. I told her that the beach house had become a symbol in the group, a place they assumed would always be available, and I told her that assumption was part of the reason I was sitting in this room at all. Her face flushed, and I watched her fight the urge to shout, because shouting would reveal the truth of her character too quickly. Grant tried to mediate, suggesting we pause, suggesting we take a breath, suggesting we focus on healing. I told him healing is not a substitute for responsibility, and that healing cannot begin until the story is honest. Then I asked the room a question I had been holding back, because I wanted it to land when everyone was already tired of pretending. I asked who, exactly, had decided the phrase one-time mistake would be the official narrative, because it had appeared too quickly and too uniformly to be organic. The room went still in a way that felt different, because this question pointed at coordination, not just opinion. A man named Theo, who had been quiet until then, cleared his throat and admitted that Elara had called him early the next morning, crying, asking him to talk to people, asking him to help. He said it with hesitation, as if he knew speaking now would make him unpopular with the group. Elara immediately tried to cut in, saying she had been desperate, saying she had not meant it like that, saying she only wanted support, and the panic in her voice made the room feel smaller. I asked Theo whether she had used the phrase one-time mistake, and he hesitated, then nodded. I asked whether she had asked him to tell others I was overreacting, and he looked down, then nodded again, because nodding is sometimes the only way people can confess without speaking the ugly words. Elara's eyes went wide, and her mouth tightened, and in that moment I could see the mask slipping. She accused Theo of betraying her, and the word betraying sounded almost comic coming from her mouth, because it was the first time she had used that kind of moral language all night. I did not gloat, because gloating would ruin the clean line of the moment. I simply said that what was happening now was the truth becoming visible, and that the truth did not need my anger to do its work. It only needed daylight. Milo tried to redirect again, saying Theo was exaggerating, saying this was turning into a trial, saying I was humiliating Elara. I told him humiliation was when you mock a betrayed man in public and then recruit a group to pressure him into silence, and I told him that what we were doing now was simply naming facts in the presence of witnesses. Milo stood halfway, as if he might storm out, then sat back down, because he could feel the room no longer belonged to him. When the meeting ended, it ended without closure, and that was the point. The group did not get a neat reconciliation scene, and Elara did not get a clean apology accepted under fluorescent lights. Instead, everyone left with something heavy in their hands, which was responsibility they could not easily throw back at me. As people filed out, several avoided my eyes, not because they hated me, but because they knew they had been wrong, and they did not know how to live with that without resenting me for noticing. Milo and Soren lingered near the door, and Milo's posture had shifted from arrogance to calculation, because now he understood that guilt would not move me. Elara walked beside me in silence, and the silence had a new texture, not coldness, but a growing fear in her, because she had just watched her social scaffolding wobble in public. In the parking lot, she finally asked what I wanted, and her voice was smaller than before. I told her I wanted the truth to be the only story in circulation, and I told her I wanted my life back from people who treated it like a community project. She said she did not know how to fix it, and I told her that fixing it would require sacrifice, not speeches, and that the first sacrifice would be the one she feared most. I told her she would have to stop protecting her image long enough to protect the truth, and the moment I said it, I watched her expression tighten again, because I could already see her calculating what honesty would cost her. As we drove away, my phone buzzed with a new message from someone in the group, and the preview on the screen said, "I am sorry, you were right. We did not handle it well." The apology felt real enough to sting, because it reminded me how easily all of this could have been avoided if even one person had chosen integrity early. I did not reply yet, because replies are commitments, and I was not interested in comforting anyone until I knew what they were really apologizing for. Instead, I kept my eyes on the road and my hands steady on the wheel, and I felt something settle into place inside me, something that was not rage or sadness, but readiness. The group had finally seen the first crack in Elara's story, and now they would start asking questions on their own, and questions have a way of pulling truth forward whether the liar wants it or not. The next morning felt quieter, but it was the kind of quiet that happens after a glass breaks, when everyone pretends they did not hear the sound because acknowledging it would change the day. Elara moved through the beach house like she was walking on thin ice, still wearing that controlled expression she used when she wanted to look reasonable, yet her hands betrayed her by fidgeting with small objects, rearranging coasters, straightening a throw blanket that did not need straightening. I watched her from across the kitchen counter while I drank coffee that tasted like burned patience, and I realized she had never been afraid of losing me in the romantic sense, because romance is a story, but she was afraid of losing the ecosystem she built around me, which included access, comfort, and a dependable audience. She tried a new angle before noon, the calm voice apology that sounds rehearsed because it is designed for witnesses, not for the injured person, and she said she was sorry for how everything looked, sorry for how it escalated, sorry for how people reacted, and the verbs kept sliding away from accountability like water off wax. I asked her slowly to name the choice she was apologizing for, not the atmosphere around it, and her eyes flicked away as if the cabinets might supply a better answer. She said she was sorry she had gone to dinner and made me feel insecure, and that word insecure was the oldest trick in the book, because it tries to reframe betrayal as my emotional weakness. I set my mug down gently and told her I did not feel insecure. I felt informed, and there was a difference that mattered more than her tone. By early afternoon, the group's new wave of messages began to arrive, and the pattern was predictable, because guilt is rarely creative. Some of them texted short apologies that sounded like they were written while standing in line for groceries, and some of them offered long explanations about how they had wanted to keep the peace, as if peace were a product you buy by sacrificing one person's dignity. Milo, of course, did not apologize, because Milo only apologizes when it provides leverage, and instead he sent a message about miscommunication and overreaction, and let's not ruin friendships over one ugly night, which read like a man trying to reset a board game after flipping the table. Soren called twice and left no voicemail, which told me he did not want to say anything that could be saved or repeated, because people who live inside other people's generosity tend to develop a sharp instinct for plausible deniability. Elara watched my phone light up over and over, and she asked if I planned to respond, and I told her I would respond when I had something to say that I would not regret later. She wanted to know what I meant by later, and I told her later was the part of the timeline where everyone stopped pretending and the consequences settled into their permanent shapes. I drove into town that evening to check the duplex again, not because I feared sabotage, but because I wanted my decisions to be based on sight instead of assumption. The neighbor I had spoken to previously saw me in the driveway and nodded with a cautious sympathy, the kind that suggests he had been hearing things through walls and open windows. I asked him, casually, whether Milo and Soren had been home, and he said they had been coming and going like they were running errands, but he added that a moving truck had not appeared, and the way he said it carried a faint amusement, because he knew men like that. I thanked him and walked around the property slowly, checking the locks, the exterior, the windows, feeling how the place held its own silence, and I thought about the way entitlement makes people believe time will bend for them even when the calendar refuses. When I returned to the beach house, Elara was sitting on the couch with her laptop open again, and she had the posture of someone preparing a presentation. She said she had been thinking about how we could move forward, and then she said we should host a small gathering at the beach house to show the group that everything was fine, and I nearly laughed, because the audacity was so pure, it felt like art. She wanted a stage, she wanted witnesses, she wanted the narrative sealed by photos and smiles, and she wanted it fast, before anyone could ask more questions. I told her no, and I said it calmly, and the calmness made her face tighten, because calmness meant I was not being pulled by her gravity. She asked why, and I told her because my home was not a reconciliation prop, and because I was not going to reward people who had tried to bully me into silence with a weekend of ocean views and borrowed comfort. She accused me of punishing everyone, and I told her punishment would require emotion and personal satisfaction, while what I was doing required only memory. She said I was becoming cold, and I told her I was becoming accurate, and accuracy always feels cold to people who benefit from blur. That night, she slept in the same bed, but she stayed on her side as if distance could serve as a bargaining chip, and I lay awake listening to the house settle, the faint creaks, the soft wind outside, the hum of the refrigerator, the ordinary sounds of a life that had suddenly become a negotiation. I thought about the community center meeting, the way Theo's confession had cracked Elara's story, the way the room had shifted when they realized coordination had happened, and I realized the group would now do what groups always do when shame touches them. They would search for a scapegoat to carry the discomfort away, and Elara would fight to make sure that scapegoat was me. The next morning, she announced she was going to meet with Paige for coffee, and she said it too casually, as if she were discussing groceries, and I heard the strategy underneath. She wanted to collect intel. She wanted to reinforce loyalties. She wanted to push her version of events into the places where it could still take root. I told her she could go wherever she wanted, because I was not going to be her warden, but I added that I would not be fooled by sudden social errands framed as innocence. She bristled, and she asked if I planned to follow her, and I told her I did not need to follow anyone, because liars always return home with something they cannot fully hide. While she was gone, I did something I had been avoiding because it felt too final. I opened the folder where I kept the property documents for the beach house, and I reviewed the ownership details with a quiet satisfaction that did not come from greed, but from clarity. The beach house was not just a place, it was the symbol the group had latched onto, the reward they thought would remain available even if they treated me like a fool. I could already imagine their summer plans, their casual assumptions about weekends and sunsets and selfies, and I felt a hard calm settle deeper in my chest. People will tolerate many things, but they panic when you remove access to the things they have been using to decorate their lives. When Elara returned, her eyes were bright in a way that looked like energy, but felt like nerves. She said Paige had felt terrible about everything and wanted to apologize, and she said it like she was delivering good news, like apologizing was a cure instead of a symptom. She also mentioned, too quickly, that Paige had heard a rumor that I was kicking people out to control the narrative, and I noted the phrase because it sounded like something Elara would plant. I asked who started that rumor, and Elara shrugged, but the shrug had tension in it, because she had a name and did not want to say it out loud. That afternoon, I received an email from the property portal again, and this time it was not a maintenance request. It was a message from Milo sent through the portal, asking for an extension due to hardship, and the words were almost funny because they came from the same man who had told me I was overreacting to betrayal. Hardship apparently was real when it belonged to him, and imaginary when it belonged to me. I printed the message, slipped it into my folder, and wrote the timestamp in my notebook, because if you want to understand a person's character, you look at what they call unfair when it happens to them. Elara watched me print the message, and she asked if I was going to give them more time, and the question sounded like hope wearing a mask. I told her no, because deadlines exist for a reason, and because granting extensions to people like Milo only teaches them the world negotiates with tantrums. She accused me of being vindictive again, and I told her vindictive would mean I enjoyed it, and I did not. What I enjoyed was the sound of consequences clicking into place like a lock. That night, my phone rang with an unknown number, and I let it go to voicemail because unknown numbers are often someone trying to control the first impression. 10 minutes later, the voicemail appeared, and the voice was female, older, controlled, and sharp, with the practiced tone of a person used to being listened to. She introduced herself as Miriam, and she said she was Milo's mother, and she said she understood there had been some disagreement, and then she asked if we could talk like adults, as if her son had not spent the last week behaving like a spoiled tenant with a microphone. She ended the voicemail by reminding me that people make mistakes, and the phrase landed like a cheap perfume because it was the same narrative in a different mouth. Elara heard the voicemail play through the speaker, and she went still because she recognized the danger of outside family pressure. She asked what I planned to do, and I told her I planned to ignore it, because when people recruit parents, it is rarely about resolution. It is about forcing you to look cruel in front of new witnesses. She said I should at least respond politely, and I told her politeness was not a requirement when someone called me to negotiate my boundaries like they were a lease clause. Her mouth tightened, and she said I was making enemies, and I told her I was making distances, and enemies were just what entitled people call you when you stop feeding them. By the end of the week, the group's panic had grown louder, and loudness is always a sign that subtle manipulation has failed. Milo began sending messages to mutual friends, and those friends began forwarding them to me with awkward captions like, "I thought you should see this," because they wanted to appear transparent without becoming involved. Milo's messages were a blend of indignation and self-pity, accusing me of turning a personal issue into a housing crisis, insisting he had paid enough over the years by being my friend, as if friendship were a currency you deposit to withdraw favors later. He also hinted that he knew things about me, which was the kind of vague threat people use when they have nothing but want you to think they do. Soren, in contrast, tried a softer approach, reaching out to ask if we could meet privately to talk man to man, and I could almost hear Milo coaching him to use humility as a key. I declined, not because I feared Soren, but because private meetings are where stories get rewritten without witnesses. If they wanted clarity, they could write it down, because written words hold shape longer than spoken ones. Elara said I was being paranoid, and I told her paranoia is fear without evidence, while what I had was evidence without fear. On Saturday morning, Elara suggested we drive into town together, framing it as a simple errand day, and I agreed because I wanted to watch how she moved when she thought she could steer me. In the car, she tried to talk about the wedding plans like they still existed, mentioning venues and menus and guest lists as if the future could be rebuilt by pretending the present was temporary. I let her talk until the words ran out. Then I asked her a question that cut through all the decorations. I asked whether she had told the man from that dinner what was happening now, and whether she had warned him that my patience had ended. She said she had not spoken to him, and she said it too quickly, and I felt the lie before my mind even processed the words. We stopped at a grocery store, and while Elara walked toward the produce section, my phone buzzed with a notification from a shared account I used for household bills, a simple merchant alert that was mine, not hers, because it was tied to my card. The alert showed a small charge from a cafe in town, the kind of place Elara claimed she had never liked, and the timestamp was recent, within the last hour. I stared at the screen long enough for the suspicion to become a shape, and I thought about her coffee with Paige, her sudden errands, her nervous brightness. When she returned with a basket, I asked her calmly whether she had stopped at that cafe earlier. She blinked once, then smiled and said no, and the smile was wrong because it arrived too late. I did not accuse her, because accusations are loud, and I was done being loud. I simply nodded as if I believed her, and I let the moment pass because I wanted her to commit to the lie while the alert sat in my pocket like a quiet witness. That is the thing about small documented truths. They do not need drama, they simply wait. We finished shopping, and on the drive back she tried to act normal, talking about the weather, about a movie she wanted to see, about some friend's new job, and I listened with the detached curiosity of someone observing a performance he no longer buys tickets for. Back at the beach house, I pulled out my notebook and wrote the merchant alert down, the exact time, the amount, the location, and I attached it to a simple question mark beside Elara's claim that she had not been there. It was not a smoking gun, and I did not need it to be, because I was not building a courtroom case. I was building a pattern, and patterns are how you dismantle lies that rely on isolated excuses. Elara noticed the notebook on the counter and asked what I was writing, and I told her I was keeping track of dates, because dates do not change their stories when you pressure them. That evening, we received a message in the group chat, a sudden announcement from Paige that she wanted everyone to reset and heal, and she invited the entire group to a small sunset gathering at the beach house. The message was written like a celebration, filled with fake warmth and emojis, and it included a line about how we all need to remember what matters. The message also casually assumed the beach house was available, as if my home were an Airbnb listing that defaulted to open. Elara looked at me, and her eyes held that hopeful pressure again, the pressure that said if you refuse, you will look like the villain in front of everyone. I stared at the message and felt something almost calm enough to be pity. They had not learned anything from the community center meeting because they still believed optics would bend reality. They thought if they gathered at my property, took photos, laughed, and posted smiles, then the story would be sealed in public memory as reconciliation. I could almost see the captions already, the passive-aggressive lines about forgiveness and growth and moving on, all designed to paint me as the man who almost ruined everything, but was saved by the group's love. Elara waited for my answer, like a child waiting to see if a parent will cave, and I took my time, because time itself is a kind of authority. I responded in the group chat with a single sentence, polite, firm, and impossible to misinterpret. I said the beach house would not be hosting gatherings, and I said future access would be determined privately. I did not explain, because explanations are invitations for debate, and I did not want debate. The chat went silent for a few minutes, and then messages began to appear, first from Paige with a wounded tone, then from others pretending they were just asking, then from Milo with an accusation that I was weaponizing property. Elara watched the thread unfold, and I saw her expression shift from hope to anger, because now her plan for a public reset was dying in real time. She said I was humiliating her, and I told her she was humiliating herself by treating my home like a bargaining chip. She said I was ruining friendships, and I told her those friendships had already proven what they were worth when they laughed at betrayal and called it an overreaction. She asked whether I even wanted to marry her anymore, and I held her gaze and told her I wanted truth more than I wanted any wedding. Her mouth opened as if to speak, then closed, because she realized truth was the one thing she could not easily offer without losing something she cared about. Late that night, a car pulled into the driveway, headlights sweeping across the living room wall like a searchlight. Elara froze, and I felt the small shock of surprise turn quickly into recognition, because entitled people do not accept no when they believe a space belongs to them. I stood and walked toward the front window, and through the glass I saw Milo's silhouette step out of the car, with Soren behind him, and two more figures I recognized from the group. They had come without permission, carrying bottles and that casual posture people use when they want to force you into being rude. Elara whispered that this was insane, and her whisper sounded like fear of scandal, not fear for me. I opened the door and stepped onto the porch, letting the ocean air hit my face like cold punctuation. Milo greeted me loudly, acting cheerful, acting like this was spontaneous fun, acting like the group chat refusal was a misunderstanding. He tried to walk past me, and I stepped sideways to block the entrance, keeping my voice calm and low. I told him the beach house was not open to guests, and I told him to leave. Milo's smile tightened, and he said we could talk inside, and I told him no, because inside is where he would try to control the tone, and outside is where the boundary was visible. Soren tried the soft approach, saying they just wanted to clear the air, saying everyone missed the old vibe, saying I was making everything heavy, and I listened without reacting because reacting would feed them. One of the other friends, Paige's boyfriend, muttered that I was being dramatic, and I felt a brief flash of something sharp, but I kept my face steady because steadiness is a kind of insult to people who want you emotional. I told them again to leave, and I added that if they refused, I would call a tow company to remove their vehicle from my private driveway because private property is not a metaphor. It is a legal fact. Milo scoffed, and in that scoff, I heard the real Milo. The Milo who thought my threats were bluffs, because historically, I had always softened. He took a step closer, lowering his voice, and he said I was going to regret making enemies. And he said he had photos. He said he had stories. He said he knew things about Elara too, and the way he said Elara too made my stomach tighten, because it suggested the betrayal might have been larger than I had mapped. Elara's head snapped toward him, and her face went pale, because she understood the danger of that word too. I looked at Milo and asked, very calmly, what he meant by Elara too, and the question hung in the air like a hook. Milo hesitated for half a second, and that half second was enough to confirm he had something, whether it was truth or a weaponized lie. Elara whispered Milo's name like a warning, and Milo smiled again, smaller now, because he could feel the leverage forming. I stepped forward just enough to make it clear the porch belonged to me, and I told them they had 1 minute to return to their car and leave. Milo's smile faded and his eyes narrowed, and I realized he had not come here to apologize at all. He had come here because he believed the beach house was his last pressure point, and now, standing in my driveway with the ocean behind me and my door at my back, I could feel the next layer of the story starting to surface, because Milo was about to trade whatever he knew for whatever he wanted, and I was about to find out whether Elara's betrayal had been a single event or a whole hidden arrangement. They left when they realized I meant the tow call, but Milo did not leave quietly, because men like him never walk away without trying to dent the door frame on the way out. He backed down the steps slowly, holding his bottle like a prop that proved he was still casual, still unbothered, still the funny guy whose jokes are supposed to forgive everything. Soren kept glancing at Elara, and the two tag-alongs watched me like I was an exhibit, something they could point to later and say I had gone unstable, because that was the safest story for them. Milo paused by the car, turned his head, and said, in that half-friendly, half-poisoned voice, that we would talk soon, because people deserve to know what kind of man I really was. I nodded once, without offering him emotion, because emotion is exactly what he came to steal. When the car lights disappeared down the road, the house did not return to normal, because normal had been canceled. Elara stood behind me in the doorway, and her breathing had that shallow pace that comes with panic. Yet she tried to wear it like indignation. She asked what Milo meant, and the question sounded like she wanted me to answer in a way that would protect her. I asked what Milo meant, and I kept my voice even, because evenness forces people to fill the silence with truth. She said she did not know. She said Milo was drunk. She said he was trying to scare us. And she said all of it too quickly, like she was stacking statements to build a wall. I stepped inside and closed the door, then I told her to sit down, not as an order, but as a way to stop her from pacing, because pacing is how people outrun the consequences of their own words. She sat on the edge of the couch, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles looked pale under the lamp. I sat across from her, keeping enough distance to make it feel like a formal meeting, because the time for soft voices and private comfort had passed. I asked her directly whether Milo had ever been involved in her life in ways she had not told me. Her eyes widened in a way that looked rehearsed, and she said no, never. And the word never hung there like a cheap curtain trying to cover a hole. I asked her again, but this time I changed the shape of the question, because liars prepare for one phrasing and stumble on another. I asked whether she had ever asked Milo for help with anything related to our relationship, our finances, our properties, our friendships, or my reputation. She blinked twice and said she had asked for advice, like anyone might, and then she tried to minimize it by calling it venting, as if venting could not become a strategy. I asked what she vented about, and she said she vented about how I could be controlling, how I liked to plan things, how I kept boundaries, how I did not always share everything I was thinking. That sounded like a script, because it matched the group's talking points too perfectly, and I felt the realization settle in my chest like a weight that had finally found the floor. I told her that when multiple people repeat the same description of you, using the same words, it is usually not a coincidence. It is a coordinated narrative. She tried to argue that friends influence each other, that this was just group dynamics, and she said it with the tone of someone who had read an article and decided it could be used as a shield. I asked whether she had been the one to introduce those words into the group, whether she had primed them to see my calm as control, my boundaries as punishment, my refusal as cruelty. She did not answer right away, and that pause was loud enough to fill the room. I stood and walked to the kitchen, not because I needed anything, but because movement gives you space to think, and I did not want to think while looking at her face. I poured myself water and drank it slowly, because slow actions calm the body, and a calm body keeps the mind sharp. Elara said my name in a pleading tone, as if she could call back a version of me that would rescue her from the consequences of her own choices. I returned to the living room and asked her if she had ever told the group that she feared I might leave her without access to the beach house. Her mouth opened slightly, and she closed it again, because the question was too specific to dodge without betraying herself. She whispered that she had mentioned the beach house once, in frustration, after we argued about wedding expenses. She said she had been upset. She said she felt insecure about our future, and she said she needed reassurance. I asked if she had told them I used property as leverage, and she said she might have said something like that, but she did not mean it, and she did not think it would turn into this. I let that land in silence, because silence is where a person hears their own actions for the first time. Then I asked the question that had been waiting behind all the others, and I asked whether Milo knew about her cheating before I did. Elara flinched, and the flinch answered the question before her mouth did. She said Milo had suspected. She said Milo had made jokes. She said Milo had tried to protect her, and the more she spoke, the more she revealed the shape of the alliance. Milo had not been a bystander. He had been a manager of narratives, a man who understood that controlling the story is often more valuable than controlling the facts. I asked whether Milo had been the one who pushed the idea that it was a one-time mistake, and Elara's eyes filled with tears, but the tears did not soften my resolve, because tears are sometimes grief and sometimes pressure. She admitted, in small pieces, that after the cheating was discovered, she panicked and went to Milo first because she believed Milo could smooth it over and keep the group on her side. She said she had been afraid I would end everything, and she said she could not bear being seen as the villain. She said Milo told her people would forgive a mistake if she controlled the framing, and she said he helped her craft the message, helped her decide what to confess and what to omit, helped her set the tone. As she spoke, I realized the first major twist was not that she cheated, but that she treated the cheating like a public relations crisis, and she outsourced the crisis management to a man who lived in my rental property. I asked whether Milo asked for anything in return, and she hesitated again, and that hesitation was the second sound of the same broken glass. She said he asked for assurances that his housing would remain stable, that I would not retaliate, that the beach house would not be taken away from the group. He wanted guarantees, and she gave him confidence, because she believed she could control me. I felt a cold clarity settle deeper, because now the whole system made sense. They were not defending her because they believed she was innocent. They were defending her because they believed her survival protected their comfort, and their comfort was tied to my assets. I told Elara that she had not just betrayed me romantically, she had turned me into a shared resource for a group that did not respect me. She tried to argue that she loved me, that she made a mistake, that she never meant to hurt me, and the words sounded like a playlist she put on when she wanted the mood to change. I asked her, calmly, whether she had ever planned to tell me the truth without being forced by evidence. She said she had wanted to. She said she was waiting for the right moment, and I told her the right moment is always yesterday for people with a conscience. Then I told her, quietly, that I would not marry someone who treated me like a foundation to be exploited. Her face went rigid, and for a moment the tears stopped, because she realized the conversation had moved from repair to conclusion. She asked if this was over, and I told her the engagement was over, because trust is not something you rebuild with apologies when you have been using it as collateral. She tried to bargain, saying we could do therapy, saying we could take time, saying we could postpone, and I told her therapy is useful when both people want truth, not when one person wants optics. She asked what she was supposed to do, and I told her she could start by telling the group the truth without blaming me for reacting to it. That night, she slept in the guest room, but sleep was not the point, because the house had become a courtroom with no judge and no closing hours. I sat at the kitchen table and built a simple timeline on paper using dates, messages, and the few concrete facts I had gathered. I wrote down the community center meeting details, Theo's confession, the eviction notices, Milo's portal message, Miriam's voicemail, the merchant alert, and the unauthorized driveway ambush. I labeled each item, and I signed the bottom of the page, because signing is how you commit to your own memory. I did not need a police report. I did not need a lawsuit. I needed my own mind to remain unshaken by the coming storm of competing narratives. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a message from Paige asking if we could talk privately, and she used a soft tone that tried to imply she was separate from the group's behavior. I replied that I would not meet privately, but if she had something to say, she could say it in writing. She responded with a long paragraph about love, forgiveness, and not letting one event ruin years of friendship. And she ended by asking if I could just let Milo and Soren stay another month until they figured something out. It was almost comedic how quickly the moral sermon turned into a housing request. I saved the message and added it to my folder, because people show their priorities by what they ask for at the end. Later that day, Elara came back into the kitchen with red eyes and a forced calm. She said she had texted the group and told them she needed space, and she said she had admitted she had asked Milo for help framing the story. She said she did not tell them everything because she feared how they would react, and that was another confession hidden inside a justification. I asked what she left out, and she said she left out the part where Milo asked for guarantees because she did not want them to think she manipulated them. I almost smiled, not from humor, but from the dark irony of it, because the only reason they had sided with her was because they had been manipulated. I told her that if she wanted any chance of dignity in this, she needed to stop managing perceptions and start telling facts. She asked if I was going to destroy her, and I told her I was not going to destroy anyone, because destruction is chaotic, and I preferred clean consequences. Then I told her the next step would not be another argument, another long night, another loop of apologies. The next step would be public, because the narrative had been made public by her friends, and it would end in public too, not with shouting, but with documentation. The group tried to regroup, which is what people do when they realize a system is collapsing, because they think if they huddle together, they can create enough warmth to survive the cold truth. Paige announced in the group chat that she had arranged a community mediation evening at the local homeowners association clubhouse, framed as a neutral space where everyone could clear misunderstandings and restore trust. It was a ridiculous proposal, but it was also useful because it created the perfect arena for what I needed next. A clubhouse meeting had witnesses, it had a sign-in sheet, it had minutes, and it had the kind of public formality that makes people cautious about outright lying, because lies land differently when fluorescent lights are watching. Elara asked whether I planned to attend, and her voice held a wary hope, because she believed a mediation night might become another stage for her to recover. I told her I would attend, but not to reconcile, and not to argue. I told her I would attend to end the story they started, using the only language they respected now, which was proof that affected their comfort. She looked at me like she was trying to guess what I had planned, and I let her wonder, because uncertainty is sometimes the only honest consequence you can offer someone who lives on control. On the day of the meeting, I dressed plainly, because plainness removes distractions. I brought a slim folder, not thick, not dramatic, because drama invites skepticism. Inside, I had printed copies of key messages, dates, and the eviction notices, along with the portal message requesting an extension, Miriam's voicemail transcript, and a single-page timeline that linked the group's pressure campaign to the housing crisis they were suddenly calling cruelty. I did not include anything that required invasive methods, and I did not include anything that could be dismissed as rumor. Everything was either written by them, sent to me, or legally documented under my name. Elara arrived separately, which was her first honest move in days, because it acknowledged we were no longer a united front. Milo arrived with Soren, and they walked in with the exaggerated confidence of men who believe the room belongs to them. Milo shook hands with a few people, laughing too loudly, trying to establish social ownership before the meeting began. Paige greeted everyone like a host, and I watched her eyes flick toward me, calculating whether I would erupt, whether I would plead, whether I would embarrass myself. When I did neither, her smile tightened, because calm men are unpredictable to people who rely on emotional manipulation. A board secretary sat at a folding table near the front, a woman with neat hair and a laptop open, and she asked everyone to sign the attendance sheet. I signed with steady handwriting and took a photo of my own signature and timestamp on the sheet, because there is power in small receipts. Milo signed with a flourish, as if he were autographing a poster. Elara hesitated before signing, and I could see her thinking about how names on paper become anchors you cannot float away from later. Paige opened the meeting with a short speech about friendship, community, forgiveness, and not letting personal issues damage the group. She framed it like a moral lesson, because moral lessons are useful when you want to shame someone into surrender. She then invited Milo to speak first, because of course she did, because the performance needed a villain and a victim, and Milo was happy to play the victim. He talked about loyalty, about mistakes, about how friends should not be punished for one person's emotions, and then he pivoted smoothly into how his housing situation had become unstable because I was acting out of spite. He said he and Soren were being made homeless over drama, and he glanced around the room as if expecting sympathetic gasps. Soren added his own softer version, saying he respected me, saying he wished we could talk privately, saying he did not understand why this had escalated, and he said it with that smooth tone that tries to make you seem unreasonable for wanting accountability. The room murmured with the usual social noises, the little hums people make when they want to be seen as compassionate without committing to a side. Elara sat stiffly, hands folded, eyes forward, and I could feel her praying that I would either forgive or explode, because either outcome would restore the story's simplicity. When Paige invited me to speak, I stood slowly, keeping my posture relaxed, and I walked to the front without rushing, because rushing looks like fear. I placed my folder on the table and looked at the group with the kind of calm that makes people uncomfortable, because it forces them to confront their own behavior without the distraction of your anger. I said I would keep it simple, and I said I would not argue, and I said I would only present dates and written words. I then handed the board secretary a single page, my timeline, and I asked her to include it in the meeting record as a factual statement from me, because meetings with minutes create accountability. Paige tried to interrupt, saying this was not a legal proceeding, and I told her I understood, and that was why I was not presenting accusations, only records. I asked the secretary to confirm she had received the page, and the secretary nodded and typed, and the sound of the keys felt like the cleanest form of justice. Then I held up a printed screenshot of Paige's message requesting a month extension for Milo and Soren, and I asked the room, calmly, why a conversation about forgiveness had turned into a housing negotiation. Paige's face tightened, and she said she was just trying to help, and I said, help is noble when it does not require pressuring the injured person to subsidize the consequences. I then presented Milo's portal message asking for hardship extensions, and I asked Milo whether he had called my reaction an overreaction before he realized his rent-free comfort was ending. Milo laughed nervously and said I was twisting things, and I told him the message was printed exactly as he wrote it. I then presented a copy of the eviction notices, and I reminded the room that the notices were lawful, time-stamped, and served, and that they were not a surprise to Milo and Soren, because they had been told. Soren tried to soften it by saying, "Friends do not do that to friends." And I said friends do not coordinate pressure campaigns to protect betrayal either. The room shifted, not into outrage, but into that uneasy recalibration people do when their moral sermon suddenly looks like a scam. I did not stop there, because stopping early is how you leave room for myth. I presented Miriam's voicemail transcript, and I asked the room why a grown man had recruited his mother to negotiate my boundaries. A couple of people glanced away, and someone coughed, and Milo's jaw tightened because the tactic looked pathetic under fluorescent lights. Paige tried to reframe it as concern, and I said concern does not call you to imply you are cruel for enforcing your own property rights. Then I turned slightly, and I addressed Elara without hostility, because hostility would turn her into the victim again. I said the engagement was over, and I said it simply, and the room went quiet enough to hear someone's chair creak. Elara's face went pale, and I watched her try to hold herself together, because she had expected delay and bargaining, not a clean conclusion. Milo smirked, because Milo loves fallout, but the smirk disappeared when I said the next part. I said the group had been given a narrative that framed betrayal as a minor mistake and my reaction as cruelty, and I said that narrative did not originate organically. I said Elara had asked Milo for help framing it, and I said Milo had asked for assurances about housing and beach house access in return. Elara whispered that I was humiliating her, and I told her I was stating facts, and facts do not humiliate people, choices do. Milo tried to deny it, calling it an interpretation, and I asked him calmly whether he wanted me to read Theo's earlier confession summary aloud, the part about coordinated messaging and pushing the overreaction angle. Milo's eyes flicked to the secretary, to the room, to the sign-in sheet, and I could see him calculating how much denial could survive official minutes. He said this was a private matter, and I said it had become a community matter the moment they tried to use the community to pressure me. Paige looked like she wanted to regain control, and she suggested a break, but I did not let the momentum drift into comfortable vagueness. I said I was not asking anyone to pick sides now, because I had no need for their validation. I said I was informing the room that Milo and Soren would vacate the duplex as scheduled, and that any attempt to enter the beach house without permission would be treated as trespass. I said it calmly, without threat, because boundaries spoken plainly are more terrifying to entitled people than any raised voice. Then I sat down, because sitting down is how you signal you are finished, and finishing is the one move manipulators hate. The secretary continued typing, and the rhythm of it felt like the meeting's spine. Milo exploded into a speech about betrayal and loyalty, but his words now sounded like the noise of a man realizing his social armor had cracked. Soren tried to apologize, half-heartedly, but the apology was aimed at the room, not at me, and I could hear that too. Paige tried to salvage it by saying everyone was under stress, that misunderstandings happen, that we should not punish people forever, and I watched the room's faces. Some looked embarrassed, some looked angry at being used, and some looked quietly relieved that someone else had finally said what they had suspected. The late twist arrived not with a confession, but with a phone. One of the quieter friends, a woman named Maris who rarely spoke in the chat, stood up and said she had something to add because she was tired of watching people manipulate the story. She said Milo had been bragging weeks earlier that he had coverage if things went bad, and she said he had shown her a draft message he planned to send to the group, accusing me of being controlling, possessive, and financially abusive, and she said the draft had been written before the cheating was ever publicly known. The room went still in a new way, because this was not about a mistake anymore. This was about premeditation. Milo snapped at her to sit down, and Maris held her phone up and said she had saved a screenshot of the draft because it made her uncomfortable. Paige tried to shut it down, saying this was not the time, but Maris said this was exactly the time, because the time is always right when the truth finally has witnesses. She walked to the secretary, showed her the screenshot, and the secretary asked if she could email it for the record. Milo's face went hard, and for a moment I thought he might do something stupid, but he only clenched his fists and stared at the floor because violence would end him in a room with minutes. That was the real twist, because it revealed the system's true goal. The cheating was not just a mistake they defended, it was a crisis they planned to use to restructure power, to paint me as the bad man, to extract continued access to my property and my resources while wearing the mask of moral community. Milo had not been reacting to events, he had been preparing narrative weapons. Elara began to cry again, and her crying now looked different, because it was not just fear of losing me, it was fear of being seen correctly by people whose approval she depended on. The meeting ended without hugs, without resolution speeches, without the warm closure Paige wanted for her own image. People left in small clusters, speaking in low voices, avoiding my eyes, not because they hated me, but because they did not want to face what their own complicity looked like. Milo and Soren left fast, not triumphant, not loud, but tense and small. Paige lingered near the door, trying to catch me for a private talk, and I walked past her without stopping, because private talks are where people offer apologies they do not want recorded. Outside, the night air felt clean, and the ocean's distant sound carried that steady rhythm that does not care about social dramas. Elara followed me into the parking lot and asked what I wanted now, and the question sounded like she still believed there was a negotiation table somewhere. I told her I wanted distance, I wanted silence, and I wanted my life back from the hands that had been trying to edit it. She asked if I hated her, and I told her hate would mean I still cared about winning emotional battles. I told her what I felt was simpler and more final, because I felt done. When I drove back to the beach house alone, the headlights cut through the coastal road like a narrow corridor, and I realized the story had reached the point I always aim for in my own mind, the point where there is no need to convince anyone anymore. The proof had landed, the minutes had captured it, and the group had been forced to look at their own choices. The beach house remained mine, not as a trophy, but as a boundary made real. And in the quiet after the meeting, I understood the deepest consequence of all, because the people who had tried to shame me into surrender had finally learned what they should have known from the beginning. I was not overreacting, and I was not cruel, and I was not the villain they could rewrite, because I was the one holding the keys, the leases, the receipts, and the truth, and now that truth had witnesses who could not unsee it. The morning after the clubhouse meeting, I woke up with the kind of clarity that feels almost rude, because it refuses to let you pretend anything is still undecided. The air outside was clean and salty, the horizon looked indifferent, and my phone was already blinking with messages that wanted to pull me back into the same old theater. Paige sent a paragraph about how she felt attacked, how Maris had derailed the meeting, how everyone needed time to cool down, and how it would be best for the community if I paused the eviction until they could rebuild trust. It was impressive, in a grim way, how quickly her concern for Elara turned into concern for property, as if the ocean view belonged to her emotions. I did not answer, because answering would have meant I was still negotiating with a room full of people who treated my boundaries like suggestions. I spent the day doing the unglamorous work that ends stories, because endings are mostly paperwork and silence, not speeches. I confirmed the move-out inspection time with my property manager. I arranged for a locksmith to change the duplex locks the minute the tenants vacated, and I documented the condition of the unit with my own photos, taken in daylight with timestamps visible on the screen. I printed the final notice again, not because it was required, but because repetition is how you remove excuses. I also wrote a short, plain message to Milo and Soren, stating the inspection time, the key return requirement, and the exact consequence if the keys were not returned, which was simply that I would treat it as a refusal and proceed accordingly. The message had no insults, no heat, no moral lessons, because heat becomes a story they can retell, and I was done feeding their imagination. Elara tried to talk to me twice that day, first in the kitchen while I was signing a couple of documents, then later near the sliding door, when she thought the ocean might make me sentimental. She said she had not slept. She said she could not believe this was happening, and she said she felt like she was being punished by everyone at once. I told her she was feeling the shape of her own choices, which is the closest thing to justice I could offer without becoming cruel. She asked if I would reconsider the engagement if she cut them off completely, and she said it like she was offering me a bargain, a simple trade that would restore her image. I told her I had not ended the engagement because she kept bad friends. I ended it because she treated betrayal like a branding problem and recruited bad friends to manage it. She stood there, eyes wet, jaw clenched, and she said she never meant for Milo to weaponize the story. I told her that when you hand a weapon to a man like Milo, you do not get to act surprised when he uses it. She asked what she was supposed to do now, and I told her she was supposed to tell the truth, not once in panic, but consistently, even when it made her look bad, because truth is not a confession you perform, it is a behavior you practice. She did not like that, because it did not give her a shortcut, and she walked away with the stiff posture of someone who wants to be the victim, but cannot find the angle. 2 days later, the move-out inspection arrived like a scheduled storm, calm on the calendar, ugly in real life. I drove to the duplex early, not because I expected trouble, but because I preferred to meet trouble on my own terms. The street looked ordinary, with lawns trimmed and curtains drawn, but the ordinary surface hid the kind of tension that makes people act foolish. Milo's car was in the driveway, and Soren's was parked half on the curb, as if they wanted to claim public space the way they used to claim my private one. I parked across the street and walked toward the property with steady steps, because I did not want any witness, any neighbor, any passing dog walker to see me rushing like a man who had lost control. Milo opened the door before I reached it, like he had been watching from behind the blinds, and he tried to greet me with a smile that looked painted on. He said he was glad I came alone because we could talk like men, and he said it in the tone of someone who thinks masculinity is a lever. I told him I did not come to talk. I came for an inspection and keys, and I kept walking past him. Inside, the unit smelled like old takeout and cheap deodorant, and a few boxes were stacked by the wall, not enough for 2 people truly leaving. Milo's posture had that casual, lean people use when they want to look unthreatened, but his eyes kept flicking to my hands, to my folder, to the keys on the counter, as if he could sense the finality in paper. Soren emerged from the hall with a tight, nervous face, and he started with a softer version of Milo's routine, saying he hoped we could find a fair solution, saying they had been under stress, saying things got out of hand. I told him stress does not manufacture messages, it reveals priorities, and their priorities had been clear the moment the group decided my boundaries were negotiable. Milo laughed, a short bark meant to show confidence. Then he said the unit was not in move-out condition, and he said he could not return the keys yet because they needed 1 more week to finish packing. He said it as if the law ran on his schedule. I looked at him, then at Soren, then at the half-packed boxes, and I understood what they were trying to do. Because men like Milo do not surrender, they stall. Stalling creates confusion. Confusion creates time, and time creates openings for new pressure. I told them the keys were due today, and I told them the locksmith was scheduled, and I told them that if they refused to return the keys, they would not be negotiating for more days. They would be documenting their refusal. Milo's smile slipped, and he said I was being dramatic, and I said I was being clear. Then he stepped closer. not into my space exactly, but close enough to perform intimidation for an imaginary audience. He said he had friends in places who would make me regret how I handled this, and he said it with the kind of bravado men borrow from movies because they do not have real power. I did not flinch, because flinching rewards the performance, and I told him that any threat he made would be saved, printed, and attached to his name, because minutes and paper do not forget. That line did something to him, because he suddenly remembered the secretary's laptop, the sign-in sheet, and Maris's screenshot, and he realized he was no longer dealing with a private argument he could distort. He tried to pivot, saying he wanted to do the right thing, and I said the right thing was already defined in the lease. Soren looked like he wanted to disappear, which is what passive men do when the loud man starts losing. He asked if we could at least talk about deposits and extensions, and I told him the deposit was not a bargaining chip. It was a consequence determined by inspection results. I walked through the unit slowly, noting scuffs, stains, and missing fixtures, and I took photos in silence. Milo followed me like a dog that cannot decide whether to bite or beg, and he kept making small comments about how I was obsessed and controlling, as if repeating the script might still summon his old advantage. I did not respond, because I did not need to defend myself from a script that had already been exposed as pre-written. When I reached the back bedroom, I saw the small damage that made the situation useful, because it proved a point without requiring exaggeration. The window latch was bent, and the frame had fresh scratches, the kind you get when someone forces something that should not be forced. I crouched, took close photos, then stood and looked at Milo without accusation. He started to explain too quickly that it was already like that it was maintenance, that he meant to tell me, and I let him talk, because every extra word he added was another strand in a rope he was tying around himself. I returned to the living room and told them, calmly, that the inspection was complete, and the keys needed to be returned now. Milo said he would return them when he was ready, and he reached for the key ring on the counter with a slow, deliberate motion, as if he wanted the room to feel like a showdown. I reached into my folder and placed one sheet on the counter, not a threat, not a speech, just a written notice confirming the locksmith change time and the schedule for final removal of any remaining property left behind. The sheet was plain enough to be boring, and that bored him because he wanted drama, not procedure. Soren stared at the paper, then at Milo, and I watched the moment Soren's loyalty finally met Soren's fear. Soren asked Milo, quietly, whether they should just hand them over and be done, and Milo snapped at him, because Milo needed someone to dominate when he could not dominate me. Then, unexpectedly, Soren picked up the key ring and placed it on the counter, pushing it toward me with a trembling hand. Milo's head whipped toward him, furious, and for a second it looked like Milo might do something stupid, but he only slammed his palm against the wall, hard enough to make a picture frame rattle. Then he backed away, breathing like a man who had lost his stage. I took the keys, photographed them on the counter beside the notice, then placed them in my pocket. I told Milo and Soren that they had until the end of the day to remove the last items, and I reminded them that any attempt to enter the beach house would be treated as trespass, not as a friendship misunderstanding. Milo muttered something under his breath, something about me regretting this, and I told him the only regret I carried was letting him believe access was affection. Then I left, because winning is not arguing longer. Winning is ending the interaction cleanly. By the time I drove back to the beach house, the sun was low, turning the water into a sheet of dull metal, and the road felt like it was guiding me toward the final scene, whether I wanted it or not. I had expected a quiet return, the kind of quiet that follows decisive action, but quiet never survives people like Milo for long. When I pulled into the driveway, I saw an unfamiliar car near the curb, and I recognized it after a second, because betrayal has its own visual vocabulary. It was the same car Theo had mentioned, the car tied to Elara's one-time mistake, now parked as if it belonged. My pulse did not spike, because I had already accepted what kind of people I was dealing with, but my mind sharpened, because final scenes require attention. Elara was standing on the porch, arms folded, face tense, and she looked like she had been waiting for me for hours. Behind her, near the side gate, Milo's silhouette moved briefly, then disappeared, and I felt the old instinct to check the locks, to count doors, to confirm boundaries. I walked toward the porch with steady steps, and I said Elara's name once, not warmly, not harshly, just as an acknowledgement that she existed in the scene. She said Milo had come to help her pick up a few things, and she said it as if that explanation should make everything normal. I looked at her and told her Milo had no business on my property, and her jaw tightened the way it did when she wanted to argue, but knew arguing would reveal more. She said she did not invite him. She said he showed up, and she said she felt pressured because he claimed he had nowhere else to go. I nodded slowly, because I believed that Milo would show up uninvited, and I also believed she would keep the door open for him anyway. I asked where the other car belonged, and she hesitated, then said it belonged to the man she cheated with, because he had come to return something. The honesty arrived too late to impress me, but it was still useful, because it confirmed she was still playing with fire while asking me to stop smelling smoke. I told her to step aside, and I opened the door, not because I needed to enter my own home, but because entering was how I reasserted ownership in a scene that had been built to unsettle me. Inside, the air smelled different, like someone had been here long enough to leave their presence behind, and I noticed small signs, a bag near the entry, a jacket draped too casually on a chair, the kind of casual that comes when people treat your boundaries like folklore. I walked through the house without rushing, checking rooms, checking doors, and when I reached the hallway near the guest room, Milo stepped out like a bad punchline, wearing the smile of a man who thinks he can outlast consequences. He said he just wanted to talk, because of course he did, and he said Elara was a mess and needed friends, and he said it as if he were the compassionate one. I told him he had 5 seconds to leave the house, because compassion does not require trespassing. He laughed, and he said I could not stop him from being there if Elara invited him, and I looked at Elara, who stood behind me in the doorway, and I saw the war on her face, the part of her that wanted to correct him, and the part that wanted to hide behind him. I told Milo he was wrong, because it was my house, my property, my rules, and any invitation Elara gave him did not override my consent. Milo took 1 step forward, then another, and he tried to lower his voice as if intimacy would make him persuasive. He said the community had turned against him unfairly, and he said I had ruined his life over one mistake, and he said it with the same moral framing he used when he wanted to make himself the victim. I told him he ruined his own life when he drafted a smear message before the cheating even broke, and I reminded him that Maris's screenshot existed, which meant his intention was documented. His smile faltered, and his eyes flicked toward Elara again, because he needed her to hold the door open, and he needed me to believe she still did. Elara said we should all calm down, and she said it in that tired tone people use when they want the conflict to stop without acknowledging why it started. I told her calm was not the issue, access was the issue, and I asked her why the man she cheated with was outside my house at dusk, on a day I was executing the final consequences of her friend's pressure campaign. She said he was returning a watch, a gift she had borrowed, and she said it with a desperate simplicity, as if naming an object could shrink the betrayal. I told her she could leave the watch on the porch, and she could tell him to leave. And if she could not do that, then she was proving she still preferred comfort over integrity. Milo tried to step around me toward the living room, and I shifted once, not aggressively, just enough to block his path, the way you block a dog from entering a room it does not belong in. He reacted with irritation, and he raised his hands theatrically, saying I was acting like security, and I told him that was exactly right, because he had forced me to become the thing he mocked. He then did what men like Milo always do when they cannot win on truth, because he tried to win on chaos. He turned his head toward Elara and told her she deserved better than a man who treated her like a tenant, and he told her she could come with him and start over, and he said it loud enough to feel like a declaration. Elara's face contorted with shock and embarrassment because she knew what he was doing, and she also knew she had created the conditions for it. She said no, quickly, and Milo scoffed, saying she was scared, saying she was trapped, saying she did not see how I manipulated everyone. He tried to speak for her, and the attempt was ugly because it revealed his real interest, which was control, not friendship. I looked at Elara and told her she could end this now by telling him to leave, clearly, without softening it. She stared at me for a long moment, then she finally said, Milo needed to go, and she said it with enough firmness that it sounded like her voice rather than his script. Milo's expression hardened, and he shifted his weight, and for a heartbeat, the room felt like it might tilt into something physical. I held my posture steady, because panic would turn me into the story he wanted. I told him the locks had already been changed at the duplex, and I told him the beach house entry code had been changed too, and I told him his access was finished. He sneered and said I was obsessed with control, and I said control was not my hobby, it was my boundary, and he had confused the two because he benefits from people who do not enforce either. From outside, I heard a car door close, and the man Elara cheated with stepped onto the porch, visible through the glass, lingering like he thought he had a right to witness the fallout. That was the moment the scene turned fully into the kind of public humiliation Elara always feared, because now there were multiple witnesses, and the proof of her choices had bodies attached to it. Elara's shoulders sagged as if the weight finally became real, and she whispered that she did not want this, and I told her she built this with 1,000 small choices and one big lie. I walked to the front door, opened it, and looked at the man on the porch with a calm that made him uncomfortable. I told him to leave the watch on the step and walk away. He started to speak, maybe to apologize, maybe to justify himself, and I raised one hand slightly, not threatening, just signaling that his voice was no longer relevant in my house. He placed the watch on the step and backed away, eyes flicking toward Elara like he wanted reassurance, and she did not give him any, because she could not even reassure herself. Then I turned back inside, and I looked at Milo, and I told him to leave now, because the last invitation had been revoked. Milo took one step toward the door, then stopped, and he tried one final pressure move because he could not resist. He said he would tell everyone I threatened him. He said he would claim I was unstable, and he said it like that might scare me into softness. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. Then I showed him the screen, where a simple audio recording icon sat with a timer that had been running for several minutes. I did not gloat. I did not smile. I did not announce it like a victory, because the point was not performance. The point was reality. Milo stared at the phone, then at me, and the color drained from his face in a slow, satisfying way. He left without another word, shoulders tense, steps stiff, and when he passed Elara, he did not even look at her, because Milo does not look at people once they stop being useful. Elara watched him go, and something in her expression cracked, because she finally saw what she had empowered, and she finally saw that his loyalty was always a transaction. When the door closed, the house felt quieter in a deeper way, the way it feels after a storm has passed, and you realize the damage is not ongoing anymore. Elara stood in the entry, staring at the watch on the porch through the glass, as if the object was a symbol she could not decode. She asked what would happen now, and the question sounded like she still expected me to guide her through the consequences gently. I told her what would happen now was simple, and I told her it would happen tonight, because delay is how people sneak back into your life through exhaustion. I told her she would pack what she needed, she would leave the ring on the counter, and she would go somewhere else, because the beach house was no longer a shared dream, it was a boundary line. She began to cry again, and she said she loved me, and she said she never wanted to lose me, and I believed she believed it, which was the saddest part. I told her love is not a feeling you declare after betrayal. Love is a behavior you practice before it, and she had practiced secrecy, manipulation, and outsourcing. She asked if there was anything she could do to fix it, and I told her fixing requires honesty without strategy, and she had not learned how to be honest without calculating the audience. She reached for the ring on her finger, as if it was welded there, then she slid it off slowly, and the small sound it made against her knuckle felt louder than any speech. She placed it on the counter, right where the house keys used to sit, and she looked at me with a face that wanted mercy and closure at the same time. I did not give her a dramatic farewell, because drama would have been a gift. I simply nodded once, because nodding was enough to mark the moment as real. She turned toward the hallway, then paused, then asked if I would at least tell the group she was not a monster. I looked at her and told her I would not tell the group anything, because I had spent too long living inside narratives other people tried to write, and I was done being anyone's editor. She stood there, absorbing that, and I watched her realize that the story would no longer have my voice cushioning her reputation. She picked up a bag, moved toward the door, and hesitated once more, as if she expected me to stop her, but I did not move. Then she walked out, the ocean air meeting her like an indifferent witness, and she stepped off the porch into the dusk with the kind of uncertainty that finally matched the uncertainty she had forced onto me. I closed the door behind her, and I locked it, and I stood there in the entryway with the ring on the counter and the watch on the porch, two small objects that represented two different kinds of betrayal. The phone in my pocket held a recording of Milo's last threats. The folder on the table held the documents that ended his access, and the silence in the house held the only conclusion that mattered. The story they tried to write about me had failed in the only way that counts, because it had met a man who did not need approval to enforce his own boundaries. And in that locked, quiet moment, with the ocean humming outside like a metronome, I understood the final truth with surgical clarity. They were not homeless because I was cruel. They were homeless because they thought my kindness was a loophole, and now the loophole was closed.